For nearly a quarter of a century, in practically every speech I have ever delivered, in every radio and television broadcast I've ever made, in practically everything I've ever written, I have emphasized one simple idea taken from a sentence by Thomas Jefferson. The sentence, "In questions of political power, speak to me not of confidence in men, but bind them down from mischief with the chains of a constitution." For expostulating that idea for more than a quarter, or for almost a quarter of a century, the liberals rather liberally condemn me as an apostle of discord, a hate monger, trying to undermine the confidence of the people in their elected political leaders. The liberals said that in a democracy like ours, we must have absolute confidence in our elected leaders, and once elected, we should give them unfailing support to promote the general welfare for the benefit of all of us. Suddenly this year, of course, times are altered. Now everybody knows we should not trust our elected leaders. Two more points remain to be made obvious. One is that if we had kept them bound down with the chains of a constitution, most of the problems now harrowing our society would not even exist. And secondly, let's bind them down. On September 12th of this year, in a report to constituents, Congressman H.R. Gross said, quote, "The day may not be too distant when the stars and stripes, symbol of a free society, is hauled down, and in its place will be the hammer and sickle, or some other symbol of capitulation to dictatorship." End quote. Now, Mr. Gross, as most of you know, is an intelligent, well-educated, mature, cautious, experienced, conservative gentleman. Why would he make such a sensational statement? Because it tells an important truth that people ought to be aware of. Much of what prompted that remark by Congressman Gross has occurred during this contemporary period when campaigners and Watergaters have held state center. The Secretary of HEW has been busy during most of this summer selecting 10 different groups of individuals who will start operating the first day of next year. They will operate under the acronym PSRO. PSRO stands for Professional Standards Review Organization. PSRO will have jurisdiction over every doctor who treats any patient under Medicare or Medicaid, or whose medical expenses are paid in part by Social Security funds. This gives PSRO control over a very high percentage of all doctors. What kind of control? PSRO examiners can search through a doctor's files and records, not just his business files, but also the traditionally privileged and confidential medical records on patients. The PSRO examiner will need no search warrant, court order, or other authority to make such searches. All he will need is a desire to make the search and his government identification card. The PSRO examiner can second-guess a doctor's professional decision about treating a patient and penalize him for having made the decision. The PSRO examiner can overrule the doctor's professional decision. Now, like every activity of every federal regulatory agency, PSRO's activities were authorized by Congress, we're told, for the exclusive purpose of protecting the people. PSRO is supposed to keep doctors from prescribing care and services which government agents may consider medically unnecessary. And this, we are promised, will hold down the cost of medical care subsidized by federal funds. To that end, PSRO is given broad powers to violate not only the professional privileges and the constitutional rights of medical practitioners, but also the basic constitutional rights of patients. Under certain conditions, a PSRO examiner can order a patient to change doctors. He can tell a patient whose doctor has suggested hospitalization that he must go to a nursing home instead, and vice versa. The PSROs were created by an obscure provision in the Social Security Amendments Act of 1972. Frank Woolley, Executive Director of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, indicates just how obscure when he estimates that today 90% of the doctors in the private practice of medicine don't even know that this law exists. And Mr. Woolley adds that if doctors do not soon wake up and join the fight for the freedom and integrity of their own profession, they will eventually find themselves chained to a medical system dominated and run by the national government, and they will have nothing left to fight for. Now, is it not obvious? Is it not perfectly obvious that the PSRO legislation was the work of New Left radicals who want to destroy constitutional government and make all of us subjects of a communist socialist dictatorship? Isn't that obvious? Well, no, it isn't. Not at all. I believe it a fact that all such legislation as PSRO is conceived and subtly managed by conspirators dedicated to the destruction of our civilization. But the fact is never obvious. Actually, known radical leftists have not publicly given vigorous support or sponsorship for any of the major legislation that is gradually sucking our nation into the morass of communism socialism. The radical leftists always propose and support legislation much worse than the bills that get enacted. And they harshly criticize the bills that are passed. Well, they vote for them, you understand, but they criticize them. And that leaves public leadership for the socialistic legislation that gets enacted in the hands of nominal conservatives. That means people who call themselves conservatives, or whom liberals call conservatives. And that allays the fears of the people and makes passage of the bills possible. The people may not like that awful proposal by someone like Bella Abzug or Edward Kennedy, but the compromise measure that took its place must be all right if Senator Bill's brother Buckley voted for it. And in the case of PSRO, Senator Buckley did vote for it. And so did Senator Kennedy. And so did Congressperson Abzug. The congressional flag bearer for PSRO was a nominal conservative, the Republican senator from Utah, Wallace Bennett. I could not find a record anywhere of any known radical leftist member of Congress speaking one word in support of PSRO, but all of them who were present to vote voted for it. And that's how it happens in Washington. But why do the people let it happen? The people generally ask for it because they have been persuaded that they need protection by the federal government from business. And business, as I use it here, broadly, means the activity of producing at a profit to oneself goods or services that other people buy. And that embraces, of course, professional services. The fraud of consumer protection by federal legislation began a long time ago. The first major consumer protection federal law was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which created the ICC to regulate railroads. Public rhetoric for this law called the railroads coercive private monopolies and accused them of bribing government officials, of charging the public outrageous rates, of discriminating against certain industries or geographical areas while favoring others. Most of these accusations were true, but the label private monopolies was inaccurate. It is quite impossible for a private enterprise of any kind to acquire monopolistic control over any segment of the national economy. Monopolies can exist only when supported by the force of government. The offending railroads of the 19th century were built with government subsidies, and they operated under laws, both federal and state, which gave them special privileges. Their undesirable practices were not products of the free enterprise system. They were created by government. The ICC Act did not break up the so-called railroad monopoly. It disintegrated under the assaults of competition. Even with its government-granted special privileges, the railroad monopoly was dying before consumer protection propaganda for government controls ever began. the railroads tried to form private cartels among themselves for protection against rate cutting and other bothersome competitive practices in the industry. But always there was some maverick who thought he could improve his lot by breaking out of the cartel and getting a large share of the market by reducing rates and providing the public with good services. Consequently, the railroad asked the government to do for them the price fixing which they were unable to do for themselves. The real pressure that induced Congress to enact the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 did not come from reformers bemoaning abuses by powerful railroad interests. It came from railroad interests asking Congress to shield them against the harsh winds of competition. Though created ostensibly to protect the public from rate gouging by the transportation industry, the ICC has devoted its primary effort to keeping transportation rates up rather than down. This seemed good to the protected railroads for a while, but they paid a price for it. Government saddled railroads with very heavy costs. They were forced to continue services which occasioned crushing losses. The Federal Railway Labor Act of 1926 gave unions monopolistic control of the railroad's operating employees, and the unions used their monopolistic power to impose upon the railroads high costs, low productivity, and occasional crippling strikes. Operating under such burdens and prohibited from cutting rates to match those offered by rival modes of transportation, the railroads could not compete. Now and then a railroad company did try ingenuity and innovation to bring down costs so that it could offer better rates to the public and thus get more business. But government regulators call this destructive competition in the transportation industry and would not permit it. Railroad services and finances degenerated rapidly after World War II. In 1970, Nixon signed the Amtrak law, which set up a government corporation to operate railroad passenger services. The public was washed with a great deal of rhetoric about how it was entitled to the kind of fine services Amtrak was going to provide. But the real purpose of Amtrak was to permit the railroads what the ICC wouldn't let them do. That is to say, divest themselves of money-losing passenger services. In June 1971, the nation's biggest railroad system, Penn Central, declared itself bankrupt. 6 months later, December 1971, Congress forced upon the railroad industry an across-the-board 13.5% pay raise for all railroad workers. And then, to compensate for that blow, Congress passed the Emergency Rail Services Act of 1971, authorizing government-guaranteed loans of your money up to $125 million to any railroad that goes bankrupt. Today, most railroads in America operate like the corporate trust that ran the government-controlled businesses of Nazi Germany under Hitler. Under the guise of protecting the consuming public, the government regulated the great railroad industry into oblivion as a genuine private industry at a staggering cost to the consuming public allegedly being protected. Cost in poor or non-existing services, in high rates, and in huge outlays of their tax money. The story of other modes of transport is not identical with that of railroads, but it is unfolding inexorably in the same direction. Now, the importance of all of this today is that the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was the foot in the door. If the government could regulate the railroading business, it could regulate others. The foot was kept in the door until the door was taken off the hinges. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 is the ancestor of most of the very worst legislation enacted by Congress in this century. Among the descendants, direct and collateral, of the old 1887 law are the federal labor laws, federal farm programs, OSHA, Social Security, and the tremendous assemblage of social welfare programs erected upon it, including those set up for the poverty war, housing laws, including urban renewal, model cities, rent subsidies, all of the federal regulatory agencies. The little grain of constitutional authority for the old ICC Act of 1887 and for those that followed in its wake is one clause giving Congress power to regulate interstate commerce. Now that provision was intended exclusively to keep state governments from erecting barriers to the free flow of trade across state lines. It did not empower the federal government to meddle with private business activities in interstate commerce. Not at all. But presidents, congresses, and federal courts, without permission, under the pretext of protecting us from business, have stretched all meaning out of the phrase interstate commerce. In a series of rulings beginning in 1937, after Franklin D. Roosevelt had a majority of New Deal justices on the Supreme Court, the High Court has held that Congress can do anything it pleases to regulate commerce, even to the regulating of local trade, if Congress simply alleges that what it does is in the interest of promoting interstate commerce. The most fundamental American constitutional principle is that the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of government must be kept separate, because a consolidation of these powers is always fatal to liberty. And that is why the Constitution created a government of three distinct branches. But today, the federal regulatory agencies constitute an unconstitutional fourth branch of government in which all of the three powers are merged. No one, literally no one, knows how many federal regulatory agencies we have. They number at least in the hundreds. They have spawned a system of administrative law which violates almost every fundamental principle of liberty written into the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Congress passes a law, let us say the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, and creates a regulatory agency to administer the law, OSHA. Administering the law is, obviously, an exercise of the executive power of government. But the agency is also given broad power to make such rules and regulations as its directors deem necessary. This is obviously a grant of legislative power, because the agency's administrative rules and regulations have the full force of law. If the regulators, in administering a law which they themselves have written, think they detect a violation, they then exercise judicial power to make findings of guilt and assess penalties. In the legal enforcement of normal statutory laws, police are not allowed to make a random selection of a man's name whom they have no reason to suspect of crime, and then to raid his place without a warrant in the expectation that they may find some violation of some law. Before police can make a legal search, they must get a warrant. And before they can get a warrant, they must show a judge or other magistrate probable cause for issuing the warrant. That is, the police must present information indicating that the man whose premises are to be searched has committed a specific crime, and the police must specify the particular evidence they expect to find. But in the enforcement of administrative law, OSHA generally picks the names of business establishments to be searched by what OSHA officials call random selection, without court orders, warrants, warning, administrative notice, or any reason to suspect that a violation may have occurred. Indeed, without knowing anything whatever about the intended victim except that he is an employer, an OSHA compliance officer, anytime he pleases, can enter and search the victim's place of business to see whether any OSHA rules or regulations might possibly be violated. Making sudden raids to catch employers by surprise and find them in technical violation of some regulation is a primary OSHA enforcement tactic. In fact, OSHA can impose a $1,000 fine and a 6-month jail sentence without a trial on a person who gives an employer advance notice of an inspection. We are, you see, evolving in the United States the same kind of jurisprudence that exists in communist-controlled countries especially during the period when communists are solidifying their control. At that stage in particular, communist governments are relatively tolerant with individuals who commit crimes of violence and of moral depravity, but they brutally punish economic offenses. It is not the common criminals who are sent to slave camps in Siberia, but persons accused of disobeying the economic commands of the communist state. Similarly, in the United States, as government controls fashion our economy into the likeness of communism, businessmen who violate the economic commands of the regulatory agencies are considered more dangerous to society than criminals are. Our courts and other branches of government are becoming so permissive about crime and so concerned about the personal rights of criminals that the rights of society to protection are sometimes ignored. But businessmen accused of economic offenses are punished without due process of law. Consider one case which is by no means an isolated event. An administrative official in Ohio sentenced a man to jail after holding a secret inquisitorial proceeding. The man was not even allowed to have an attorney present. He appealed the case, eventually got it into the federal courts, and took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the sentence against this man because, the court said, quote, the trial was not a criminal trial, but was an administrative investigation of incidents damaging to the economy, end quote. Every federal regulatory agency has enough power, illegal to be sure, but power, to destroy every business within its jurisdiction. OSHA has the broadest jurisdiction of all. It covers every business that has one or more employees. If Congress ever gave OSHA appropriations to match the limitless power it has been given or has assumed, OSHA could close down every business in the United States. This will never be done in just that way because doing it would be a tactical error on the part of the conspiracy against private capitalism. If the long-range assault on free enterprise moves too fast or too massively at any one time, it might cause effective public resistance. To succeed, it must move slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, gradually intensifying until in the latter stage it can be sharply accelerated in tempo and expanded in volume on all fronts. We seem to be entering, if not already in, that latter stage. Under the guise of protecting the environment, protecting workers, protecting sick people, protecting consumers, the war against free enterprise has multiplied in intensity and magnitude almost 1,000-fold in the past 4 or 5 years since Nixon has been president. Now, I believe that OSHA's mission is to drive small, independent businesses out of existence. Not all at once, or even all of them. It is to operate with continuing, relentless harassments, most of them petty, with fines, with imposition of expense to meet OSHA requirements, and with imposition of very heavy costs to do all the paperwork that OSHA requires. Now, OSHA does all these things to big businesses, too, and the burden on them is quite great. But most big businesses can accommodate themselves to it. Most of them already have legal staffs, whereas getting legal help to defend themselves against government harassment is simply too expensive for many small businesses. Big businesses can hire squads of people to keep records and file forms for OSHA and other government agencies. And they can absorb temporarily and then pass on to consumers the immense costs which government imposes upon them. Not very many small businessmen have such economic resiliency, and a lot of them do not have the temperament for thus rocking with the punches. After a few frustrating battles with the bureaucracy, they are ready to sell out to a bigger firm or to a conglomerate. And that's the purpose of the government harassment, in my opinion. Note well, however, that in the war against free enterprise, big business is also under heavy attack. The aim is not to drive big business out of existence, but to make it accommodate itself to government controls. The intermediate goal is a socialist state operating not like the socialist state in the Soviet Union, but like that which operated in Nazi Germany. The major production and service industries of the nation will be under nominal ownership of private corporations, but the control will reside in the political center of power in Washington. The top managers of the major businesses will, in essence, be a part of the governmental establishment. Detached representatives, one might say, of the political power which controls the businesses which they have been chosen to manage. We are already rather well into this phase of the socialist revolution, too. Have you ever noticed how the top echelon management officials of huge corporations are sometimes acquired? They're not brought up through the ranks or hired away from other companies. They're hired out of high-level government jobs or out of tax-exempt foundations. Robert Strange McNamara, had no experience whatever in business management when he was hired to run the Ford Motor Company a few years ago. McNamara's experience had been in government services and foundations. This strange involvement, not of big business as such, but of certain leaders in certain big businesses in a conspiracy against free enterprise, is discussed in Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, and in my own book, The Invisible Government. It is a fascinating story. One main reason for the current massive attack on big business, and it is massive, believe me, is the need to discredit thoroughly all private business in the eyes of the general public, so that the public will not care or may even approve, if it notices at all, as government gradually drives little businesses out and takes big businesses in.
This concludes the talk by Mr. Smoot. However, one more point is in order. Since the time this talk was given, Mr. Smoot has written an excellent book that brings to light the awesome scope and power of the many agencies of the executive branch of our federal government. We highly recommend this book to you. It is titled The Business End of Government, and like Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, and The Rockefeller File, it may be purchased at any of the more than 400 American Opinion bookstores located across America.